She left the Duke's house without a word, and the man who never begged wrote her 43 letters. I have been the Duke of Velmere for 19 years, and in that time I have never begged. Not for a favorable vote in the Lords, not for the goodwill of my neighbors, not for a single thing this county or this country could offer me. My grandfather built Velmere Park on the principle that a man of sufficient rank does not ask, he indicates, and the world adjusts. I inherited his title, his coal, his debts, and his philosophy with equal thoroughness. I was, by every measure available to me, a man who did not need. Philippa Morrow left my house on the 14th of October, a Tuesday, before the sun had cleared the fells. She did not slam a door. She did not leave a letter of accusation. She asked my housekeeper, Mrs. Penhall, to convey her formal notice, settled the question of her remaining wages with characteristic precision, and was in the hired cart to Aldwick before any member of my household had thought to mention it to me. I learned of her departure at 8:30, standing in my own breakfast room with a cup of coffee going cold in my hand, and my first thought, the honest one, before pride sealed it over, was that the house had already changed temperature. I want to tell this correctly, which means I must tell you who she was before I tell you what I did. Philippa Morrow came to Velmere Park in October of 1841, 2 years to the month before she left it. She came as companion to my widowed aunt, Lady Sefton Ashworth, who was difficult, demanding, and intermittently deaf in ways that suited her convenience. Miss Morrow was the daughter of a Northumberland clergyman who had died leaving debts and no provision, and she had done what women in her position have always done. She had made herself useful. She was not what I expected. I had employed companions before, quiet, faded creatures who faded further under my aunt's management and had to be replaced. Miss Morrow did not fade. She had a way of occupying a room that I can only describe as complete, not loud, not presumptuous. She simply took up the precise amount of space that was hers, and not 1 inch more. And when she was gone from it, you noticed the vacancy the way you notice a chair moved 2 inches from its customary place. She was, I thought at the time, a very capable employee. That is the story I told myself for 2 years. I told it so consistently, and with such conviction that I very nearly believed it. What was true, I noticed when she was at dinner and when she was not. I read the letters she drafted for my aunt. They were always better than what my aunt would have produced unaided, sharper in argument, warmer in closing, and she never signed her own name to them. I observed that she handled my cousin Freddie's drunken confidences with a patience I could not have managed, that she never spoke of her reduced circumstances with self-pity, and that she had read rather more history than most men I knew. I did none of this noticing aloud. A man of my position does not announce that a household employee is interesting. It would have been unseemly. It would also, I now understand, have cost me something. A man who says nothing owes nothing. That, too, was my grandfather's philosophy. It was, I have since concluded, the philosophy of a coward. Here is what happened on the 13th of October, 1843, which is the evening before the morning she was gone. I had guests at Velmere, Lord and Lady Hartmere, and Hartmere's younger brother Edmund, who fancied himself a wit and achieved it often enough to make him dangerous. My aunt was well enough to join us at dinner, which meant Miss Morrow was present, seated at the foot of the table where the companions always sat when the numbers called for it. A fiction of inclusion that has always struck me, in retrospect, as the particular cruelty of polite society. You invite the woman you consider furniture to dinner so that she may see herself excluded more completely. Edmund Hartmere was talking about a botanical survey, something about the classification of upland plants, a subject he knew nothing about and pursued with the confidence of a man who has never been corrected. Miss Morrow, who had been quiet all evening, said, with perfect composure and no particular elevation of voice, "I believe you're thinking of the system proposed by Mr. Cartwright in 1836, not Whitmore. Whitmore's work was principally on coastal grasses. There was a pause. Edmund laughed. It was not a kind laugh. "My goodness, Calder, does your aunt's companion sit at dinner with us? I hadn't noticed." And I, Calder Ashworth, Duke of Velmere, a man who had watched Miss Morrow correct my own estate manager's arithmetic and privately thought her entirely right, I said nothing. I moved the conversation along. I talked to Hartmere about the shooting. I said nothing. She did not flinch. That is the thing I remember most clearly even now. She looked at her plate, lifted her fork, and finished her meal. Her expression did not change. She was present for the remainder of the evening with the same contained, unhurried dignity she always carried, and she bid my aunt a warm good night, and she went upstairs. And by morning she was gone. Mrs. Penhall told me at 8:30. The notice had been given formally, in writing, the previous evening after dinner. The matter of wages had been resolved. Miss Morrow's box had been brought down at 5 in the morning. The carter from the village had been prearranged. She had, in short, planned her departure with the same quiet thoroughness with which she did everything else, and she had asked for nothing and accused no one. I stood in the breakfast room with my cold coffee and looked out at the long drive. It was empty. I told myself I was inconvenienced. My aunt would be distressed. Finding a suitable replacement would be tedious. These were the acceptable thoughts, the ones that fit the story I had told myself for 2 years, and I worked through them steadily while I finished my breakfast and received my steward and attended to the morning's correspondence. It was not until the afternoon, when I walked through the east sitting room and found it unoccupied, her embroidery frame still in its usual corner, as though she had only stepped out, that something in me went very quietly wrong. I did not go to Aldwych, that must be clearly stated. I was a duke. I did not go to market towns to retrieve the companions of elderly relatives. I consulted my pride, found it fully operational, and instructed it to govern. It governed for 9 days. On the 10th day, my aunt, who had been poorly since Miss Morrow's departure, and who blamed me for it with the directness of a woman who had known me since infancy, said, from her chaise by the window, "You let Edmund Hartmere speak to her as though she were a sideboard, Calder, and you said nothing." She noticed. We all noticed. The only one who hasn't noticed anything, apparently, is you. I told her she was overstating the matter. "I have known you for 41 years, she said, "and I am telling you that you have been walking into every room in this house looking for her for 9 days. Go and find out what you actually feel, and then act accordingly, or I will find you a companion who will bore us both into the grave." She closed her eyes. That was her method of ending conversations. That evening I sat at the writing desk in the library, the desk where Miss Morrow had, on a dozen occasions, sat across from me while my aunt dictated, and I took out a sheet of paper. I wrote, "Dear Miss Morrow, I am writing to inquire as to the adequacy of your current arrangements, as I feel a residual obligation." I tore it up. I wrote, "Dear Miss Morrow, it has been brought to my attention that I failed." I tore that one too. The word failed seemed designed to invite her contempt, which, upon reflection, I thought I had sufficiently earned already. I wrote on the 3rd attempt, "Dear Miss Morrow, I did not speak when I should have. I have no excuse for it that would satisfy either of us, and I am not going to attempt one. I am writing because the house is wrong without you in it, and I have been pretending for 9 days that this is a logistical problem, and I think we both know that it is not." I stared at that for a long time. Then I sent it. She did not reply. I wrote again in a week, a shorter letter this time. I had been in the library, I said, and I had gone to the 3rd shelf to find the Northumberland Agricultural Survey, and I had remembered that she had reorganized that shelf in August, moving the surveys to the left of the window to catch better light, and I had stood there for some time looking at the surveys in their improved position, and thinking that she was right about the light and also about rather a great deal else, and that I wished she were there to be right about it. She did not reply. The letters continued. I cannot fully account for why. I am not, by disposition, a man who persists in unpromising endeavors. In business, in politics, in the management of the estate, I have always known when to cut a loss. But these letters did not feel like endeavors. They felt like the only honest conversation I had had in years, which is a strange thing to say of a correspondence conducted entirely by one party. I told her about the first frost, which came in the second week of November and left the long garden silver. I told her that my cousin Freddie had proposed to a girl from Hexham and been accepted, and that I thought the girl was probably too sensible for him, but that Freddie had always done better than he deserved. I told her that I had ridden out to the north boundary on a Tuesday, and that the low light over the fells at 4 in the afternoon was the kind of thing that ought to be witnessed, and I had found myself thinking that I would have said as much to her, had she been there, and that she would have said something precise and observant in return, and that the conversation I had imagined was better than any I had managed that week with people who were actually present. I told her in the 22nd letter that I had thought about Edmund Hartmere's remark approximately 400 times, and that every single time I arrived at the same conclusion, that there was no version of that evening in which my silence was anything other than a failure of character. That I had done it because it was easier, and because I had spent 19 years making things easier for myself at other people's expense, and that I was beginning to understand the cumulative cost of that habit. She did not reply. I wrote through November and through December and through the first cold weeks of January, when Velmere Park sat under a gray sky that hadn't changed in a fortnight, and the fires in the east wing were not enough to keep the rooms from feeling hollow. I had always liked winter at Velmere, the reduced social calendar, the long evenings in the library. I liked it less that winter. The library had too many shelves she had touched, too many volumes she had read, too many arguments she had made from the third chair from the left, the one I had quietly stopped offering to guests. In the 31st letter, I told her that. In the 35th, I told her something more. I told her that I had been, for the whole of my adult life, what my grandfather designed, a man who held rank like a wall and called it dignity, that the correct word for it was not dignity but distance, that she was the first person in recent memory who had sat across from me in the library, at my aunt's dinner table, in the long mornings when we'd argued over the management of the East Farms without her even being employed to have opinions about the East Farms, and simply treated me as though I were accountable, not to my title, to her, to what was decent, that I had found this at the time mildly irritating, that I now understood I had been, in fact, profoundly grateful. She did not reply. My aunt, who received periodic intelligence from sources she declined to identify, informed me in February that Miss Morrow had taken a position as a reading instructor at a small school for girls in Aldwick, run by a Mrs. Fainthwaite, and that she was, by all accounts, very well suited to it. My aunt said this with a satisfaction that suggested it was partly intended to wound me, and it partly succeeded. I wrote the 39th letter with this information sitting on my desk like a verdict. She had a life. She had built one, in 4 months, out of the materials available to a woman of her position, with the same unhurried competence she brought to everything. It had not required me. It did not require me. I put down the pen. Then I picked it up again, because I had discovered that there was something worse than writing letters she did not answer, and it was the prospect of stopping. The 40th letter said only, I do not know what I expected you to do with all of this. I don't think I expected you to do anything. I think I simply needed to say it to someone who would have an honest opinion of it, and you are the only person I know with that qualification. The 41st, I have been trying to determine whether this is an appropriate thing to put in a letter, which I recognize is a question you would find somewhat absurd given the things I have already put in letters. I think it is appropriate because it is true and because I have been practicing honesty and I may as well finish the course. I miss your company, not the household management and not the convenience. I miss you. The 42nd. My aunt has told me with characteristic economy that I am wasting paper. She is, as usual, not wrong. But she also said, and this surprised me, that you were perhaps waiting to see if I was capable of saying something real. I thought I had been. I am now not certain. I would like, if you are willing, to have that conversation in person and find out. The 43rd letter I did not send. I went to Aldwick instead. It is a small market town, Aldwick, with a wide high street and a posting office and a respectable if not distinguished inn. Mrs. Fainthwaite's school for girls occupied a converted wool merchant's house on the eastern edge of town, and the woman herself met me at the door with an expression of profound skepticism that I found, under the circumstances, fully warranted. Miss Morrow, she said, is not receiving. I understand, I said. Would you ask her, please? The Duke of Velmere. I know who you are, said Mrs. Fainthwaite. That is not going to be the persuasive argument you imagine. She disappeared. I stood on the step in the February cold and waited, which I had not done since childhood and found rather clarifying. She came to the door herself. I had spent 4 months writing to her, and in the aggregate those letters were a more thorough account of my interior life than I had produced for any human being in the preceding 41 years, and still the fact of her, standing in the doorway of a wool merchant's house in a gray Northumberland February in a perfectly plain dark dress with her coat over her arm because she had not been expecting callers. Still, it struck me as new. Your Grace, she said, her voice was composed. Her eyes were not unkind, but they were watchful. Miss Morrow, I said, I have 43 letters. I sent 42 of them. I thought in the end that the 43rd was better said in person. She looked at me for a moment. You'd better come in then, she said, but I should tell you before you do that I'm not going back to Velmere. I know, I said. She was surprised by that. I could see it, a fractional shift in the watchfulness, a small recalibration. Then what are you here for? To say the thing I have been practicing saying for 4 months, I said, and to give you the opportunity to tell me whether it is sufficient. She let me in. The room she received me in was small and clean and smelled of chalk and bookbinding glue. There were 2 chairs near the window and a fire that was doing its efficient best. She sat in one chair and did not offer me the other immediately, which I noted and deserved. I sat when she indicated. Well, she said. I was wrong, I said. On the 13th of October, Edmund Hartmere said something discourteous and reductive and untrue, and I allowed it to pass because correcting it would have cost me something, some social ease, some goodwill from Hartmere, some small portion of the performance of indifference that I have been staging for the benefit of no one for the better part of my adult life. And you had given 2 years of your particular and considerable intelligence to my household, and you were worth rather more than my indifference or my silence, and I knew it at the time, and I said nothing regardless. That is what I did. I'm not going to dress it differently. She was quiet. The letters, she said finally, I read them. I assumed. All of them. I hoped. She folded her hands in her lap. There was something careful in the gesture, the way there was always something careful in everything she did, but I had learned through 42 letters worth of paying attention that careful was not the same as closed. What you said in the 35th letter, she said, about accountability. About distance. Yes. That was honest. It was intended to be. It surprised me, she said. I had not expected honesty to be one of your capacities. I thought you were very accomplished at the appearance of it. That was fair, I said so. What do you want, Duke? The question was direct, in the way she had always been direct, not aggressive, but exact. Like a woman who has been made to be imprecise by circumstance and has decided, somewhere along the way, that she will no longer bother. I want, I said, to be in the same room as you, on terms that you are willing to set. I want to know if there is any arrangement of whatever kind you determine is appropriate in which you would permit that. She looked at the fire. Outside, a cart went past on the high street, and a child somewhere in the school was reading aloud in a halting, earnest voice that drifted through the walls. You understand, she said, that if I am to be in the same room as you, you do not get to then treat me as furniture. You do not get to revert to form when someone like Edmund Hartmere is watching. I understand that. And you understand that I am not a problem you can solve by sending enough letters. That is not how this works. I understand that too. Do you? She looked at me then, not unkindly, but very clearly. Because you are a man who has spent 19 years deciding what the world owes you and receiving it, and this is not that kind of thing. No, I said. It is not. I looked at her watchful eyes and her plain dress and the slight angle of her chin that I had learned, over 2 years of close proximity, indicated that she was waiting to be surprised. I am here, I said, because I have not been warm to anyone in rather a long time, and I find that I would like to try. And you are the only person who makes the prospect feel like something other than a performance. She was quiet for a moment more. Then she said, the 43rd letter. Yes. What does it say? I had it in my coat. I had carried it to Aldwych in my breast pocket, on the principle that if she refused to see me I would leave it with Mrs. Fainthwaite, who would probably use it to kindle the school's fire, which was no less than I deserved. I took it out. I put it on the small table between us. I did not suggest she open it now. That was, I had learned, the sort of pressure she would find irritating. She picked it up. She read it there with me present, which I had not anticipated, and which required me to sit in the February quiet while she read the thing I had spent the better part of a morning writing, which was this: that I had conducted 42 letters worth of cataloging what I had lost by my own carelessness, and that what I arrived at the end of all of it, was not an argument or a proposal or any of the various things a man of my resources might be expected to offer, but simply this: that I had known a great many accomplished people in my life, and I had never before felt, in anyone's company, that I was being seen as I actually was, rather than as I chose to present myself. That she had done that without effort or agenda, simply by being the kind of person who paid attention and told the truth, and that if she could find it in herself to give me the opportunity to be, in return, someone worth seeing, not the Duke, not the performance, but the actual Calder Ashworth, who was considerably less impressive and considerably more in need of correction, I would like, very much, that chance. She folded the letter. She set it on the table. She looked at me for a long time. You'll need to be patient, she said at last. I don't mean to be unkind about it, but you were careless with something, and I don't restore trust on a schedule that suits the person who was careless. I know. And you'll need to mean it. Not as a project, not as a resolution you revisit at convenient intervals. Actually mean it. Yes. She stood. She went to the window and looked out at the high street for a moment, and when she turned back there was something in her face that was not yet warmth but was, I thought, the terrain from which warmth might eventually be grown. Come to dinner on Friday, she said. Mrs. Fainthwaite keeps a good table and she will watch you very thoroughly and report back to me afterward. And if I pass her inspection, then we will see. She paused and called her. She had never used my name. In 2 years at Velmere and 4 months of letters and this conversation, she had always said Your Grace, and I had always said Miss Morrow, and we had both understood that the formality was a kind of accuracy. The name now had the weight of something shifted. I did read them, she said, all 42, rather carefully, the 35th and the 41st especially. I said nothing, which was, for once in my life, exactly the right response. Friday, she said. I went on Friday. Mrs. Fainthwaite served a very good lamb and watched me as promised, with the steady, unsentimental attention of a woman who has spent 30 years deciding which men were worth her school's association, and I was on my best behavior, which was not, I suspect, the interesting part. The interesting part was that my best behavior turned out, at that table, to feel rather like my actual behavior, like something that fit. Philippa, she was Philippa to me by spring, though I was still called her only on formal occasions, and when she thought I was being obstinate, taught at Mrs. Fainthwaite's school through the summer term. I rode to Aldwick on Fridays. I attended the school's small summer exhibition, where her students read from their own compositions, and she sat in the back of the room with an expression of private satisfaction that I have catalogued in my memory alongside the best things I have ever seen. We married in September, in the small fictional church at the edge of Velmure's village, with my aunt in the front pew in a shade of blue that was entirely too triumphant for a woman feigning neutrality, and Freddie weeping with a cheerfulness that suggested he thought the whole proceeding was primarily comedy, which perhaps it was. My grandfather built Velmure Park on the principle that a man of sufficient rank does not ask. I have amended this. What I know now is simpler. There are things you cannot arrive at by indication. Some things require you to go to a small town in February and stand on a doorstep in the cold and say clearly what you want and what you failed and what you hope, and then wait. She made me wait. She was right to. She has been right about rather a great deal else in the 4 years since. She is right about the surveys and the East Farms and the best light for reading and the precise point at which I am being a coward disguised as a duke. She tells me when that is. I have come to rely on it considerably. There are 43 letters in a box in the library at Velmure, in the third shelf from the left, in the improved position she chose for the light. She put them there herself. I do not know whether this means she has forgiven me, or whether it means she intends to keep the evidence close at hand. I have not asked. I have learned at last when not to ask, and I have learned which is rarer and took longer when I must.